You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at soxinthebasement.com.
So the buzz this week is Luis Robert Jr. trade rumors, and you know, we can get into it a little bit. I find it to be fascinating, Ed, that there are teams that are out there interested in him, but the Reds deal really fell apart because, one, they didn't want to give up the prospects that the White Sox want, so there's a prospect gap, right, and a talent evaluation gap, but also the Reds wanted money. Like, they didn't want to pay the whole $15 million. And the two $20 million options. Like, they wanted money and they wanted to give up lesser prospects. So it's an interesting story that the Reds were interested, but I mean, everybody's interested in a player like Luis Robert Jr. What they were willing to pay for and their demands on the money, that tells you they don't have a very high value of him. They're saying, you know, it's almost as if the White Sox are saying, we believe he's really 2023 Luis Robert Jr. It was injuries and not effort. We heard Scott Merkin backing that up. We've heard Chris Getz talk about it that way. It wasn't that he had a lack of effort. It wasn't that he gave up. He's a really good clubhouse guy. He's trying his hardest. You know, him chasing pitches, even though he's been in the majors now for years, and should know the book on himself well enough to know not to go up there and swing 3 straight times as something tailing out of the zone away from him and then go back to the bench. I saw that as a guy that couldn't wait to get back to the bench because the team was terrible, setting a record for losses, and he didn't want to be there anymore that season, and he just wanted the season to end. They're saying, oh, it was injury that was causing that. So it depends on what you believe. But it seems as though the White Sox at least are saying, and may actually believe it, it's injury, not effort. He really is 2023 Luis Robert Jr., so he's worth this over here. And the other teams, like the Reds, are saying, yeah, I don't know if I believe that. Like, they're me. They're sitting there going, yeah, I don't know if I want to give you my best prospects, pay the entire boat on him, and then he shows up, and the first time the going gets tough, Luis is going back to the bench after 3 swings at something that tails outside and has a puss on his face. So the perception, I don't know what reality is, but I think that's perception right now.
Well, and it doesn't really matter, because if you're the Reds or you're the Giants or you're any of the teams that have been mentioned as being interested in Luis Robert Jr., you're trying to acquire him on the basis that he also had a down year, that there's a diminished value to him, that the White Sox, in attempting to rebuild, are going to have much more value in getting a load of prospects for him, however fringy they might be, than to have one really great player, even if he is 2023 Luis Robert Jr. So if I'm a GM approaching Chris Getz, I have to approach it that way. I have to, from a business standpoint, I have to approach it with Luis Robert Jr.'s damaged goods. I'm willing to take him off your hands, and I'm still willing to give you value for him, okay? But if I'm Chris Getz, I can't do that, okay? I can't take an asset, one of my few remaining assets, and sit there and say, I have to unload this guy, and I have to get rid of him now, even though his value is suspect, because I just need bodies.
Well, that's
right?
the thing.
You can't do that if you're Chris Getz at all.
That's the thing. If he wants to move him, whatever his motivation is, the theory that he didn't like the way he was at the end of that season, so he probably wants to unload him. There's theories that he wants different type of ball players. We've talked about this. You want to have a body for baseball. You don't want to have a bodybuilder's body. That's why you're constantly getting injuries like a lot of these guys were getting. And he wants a different type of player or a different type of attitude, or he just wants to move him because he knows that he doesn't have enough prospects at all the positions that he needs prospects at. I mean, think about this. They're really deep at pitcher. They're actually really deep at catcher. And one of those catchers may turn out to be a first baseman or a corner outfielder. But besides Colson Montgomery and the new guy, Montgomery, that you picked up from the Red Sox, maybe Chase Mydroth, you don't have enough position player prospects that I'm excited about. The depth there is not there, because I've said this before on the show. Give me 3 prospects that you believe in. One of them is going to be really good. One of them isn't even going to make it, and the other one might end up being a backup. They don't all pan out. They have potential. That's the reason why you get excited about them, but they're not all going to show up. all going to be good, all going to stay healthy, and all arrive at the right time. You're going to have to go out and you're going to have to pay and you're going to have to bring in free agents, or you're going to have such a large pool of those players that you're okay with an injury that sets him back or a developmental issue that sets him back because there's another guy who accelerates and goes right past that guy. So he doesn't have that right now. So maybe you want to move Luis Robert Jr. because you're trying to bolster that. And if that's the case, great. But he's not going to get the value that he needs to get that kind of an impact prospect right now, the way that Robert Jr. is perceived. That's the problem. You unload him now and you go get middling prospects. You've really reduced the chance that any of them will become something of note later on. You need the high guys. Like, I'd rather him hold on to Luis Robert Jr. and roll the dice that Robert Jr. has a great first half and he can deal him midway through the season, or at worst, I don't know. Do you pick up the option and then trade him in the offseason? But likely you trade him mid-season and you get the most value for him, because if it doesn't work out and you're just buying Luis Robert Jr. out at the end of the year because you don't believe that he's worth $20 million because he's had 2 bad seasons, I would roll the dice to try to get the higher end prospect pool with the possibility you get nothing for him, rather than give him up for middling prospects that have a much lower chance of ever being anything for your team. So that's why I think they got to hold on to him, and they just got to hope that he has a great first half.
Well, not only that, but you got to give him an opportunity, like you said, to prove whether or not he's worth the option at the end of the year. And you're the White Sox. Yes, had the worst season in the history of the major leagues. And yes, you are in a rebuild, but what is the point of trading away a guy to get players who aren't going to impact your major league roster in any way, shape, or form, when what you're trying to do in a rebuild is translate one player who's on his way out because of contract issues, because of age, because he's not going to be a fit for you when you're in your competitive window. That's why you trade him, right? You don't trade him because you hate him necessarily. I don't think GMs really operate that way. You trade him because, from a business standpoint, you paid Luis Robert Jr. $20 million next year. Are you competing next year? Does that money matter?
I think that's funny, though. You don't trade him because you hate him, because that's not how GMs operate. Kenny Williams operated that way.
Well, Kenny Williams wasn't a very good GM.
No, he wasn't. He could walk into a room and he could look at a guy and he'd be like, that guy's going to be a star. I don't know why that never translated into more championships, but he could do it according to him, and he did trade people that he was annoyed with. But back to your point.
Yeah, and we've seen that where when GMs do operate that way, let me put it this way, when good, competent GMs operate that way, when they do it out of emotional need or response, bad things happen to your team. Okay, you end up trading a viable bat on a team that has no offense for a left-hander with arm problems. Right? Who was a former top prospect.
I remember that. Yeah.
Don't you remember that?
I remember that.
Seems familiar. But Chris Getz has not shown me that he is that guy. So I really do think Chris Getz is doing the right thing, like I said, because if Luis Robert Jr. rebuilds his value, then even if he doesn't get a haul of prospects back, all right, if you're in a position to sit there and say, I'm trading Luis Robert Jr., I'm going to get a couple of guys that might contribute. Okay, those 2 guys that are maybe one won't make it, maybe one guy will be, a piece, but not anything that you rely on. What you're really going for there is you're going for, if the Reds are going to trade you something, you want them to trade you something that is going to be an impact for years to come while he's under control, while he is, relatively inexpensive, because you have to operate under a ridiculous budget if you're Chris Getz, and somebody that is going to replace what Luis Robert Jr.'s potential, if not his actual production, was. So I'm not really worried about, at this point, Chris Getz going out and getting 5 prospects for Luis Robert Jr., because any GM that's going to give him 5 prospects is going to give you 3 bums, 1 okay guy, and then 1 guy that you're kind of counting on. If he gets 2 or 3 guys, or maybe even that 4th guy, okay, like you did with Garrett Crochet, then, we have a much better feel for what these guys are. You look at the Crochet trade, and you sit there, and we've talked about Chase Mydroth maybe starting the season on the team in the infield. We've talked about Kyle Teal creating an issue where we don't know if it's going to be Teal or Edgar Caro that eventually replaces Corey Lee behind the plate. We've talked about Braden Montgomery being the guy that comes in and might be the best of the bunch and comes in and anchors the outfield.
Yeah,
for a
potential
while.
star could be there in a little bit, but look at that return. I get your point. Look at that return. That's the kind of thing that you want to bring in. You want to have multiple pieces that you believe in that have a lot of value, not like, well, this guy hasn't been working out, but maybe you guys can develop him better. And
because that's Miguel Vargas.
Right, and that may be what's getting offered right now, and that's why they back off. A reminder for Sox in the Basement listeners, for exterior windows, doors, patio doors, and storm doors, look no further than Window and Door Superstore of Oak Forest. Instead of somebody showing up with a dingy example window and traipsing all kinds of mud and snow and slush into your living room, putting his feet up on the couch, forget that. You go in and see them in their showroom, everything's there. All the little etchings in the windows and doorknob options. It's not in a magazine. It's right there for you to look at. And you can ask the owner right there in the showroom all about it. There's also an owner on site with all installs and all Window and Door Superstore installers. They never farm out the work. That way, they get it done right. They've been doing it that way in Oak Forest since 1985 with all major brands custom made and no stock items for a perfect fit. Window and Door Superstore of Oak Forest is a half block east of 159th and Ridgeland at 6280 159th Street. See more at windowdooroakforest.com. I have a lot of faith in Chris Getz in his off-season trading, at least so far. In the off-season, I feel like his return has been solid. I liked his return for Dylan Cease. I liked his return for Garrett Crochet. His deadline stuff makes me nervous, and while we're doing this and we're thinking about the idea that Robert could be traded mid-season or close to the deadline, I get a little nervous because I didn't like the Vargas pickup. I didn't like it the moment it happened, and I know there's a lot of people are saying you're being unfair to the guy, but I just am not a believer in Miguel Vargas, and he's going to have to prove me wrong. So, there is a little bit of nervousness on my part about, okay, we're going to let him play. We're going to get his value up, but will we actually get what we want in a mid-season deal? Maybe Chris Getz learned some lessons. He is a first-time GM. Now, there are other teams that have kicked the tires on Luis Robert Jr. The Giants have kicked the tires on Luis Robert Jr. as well. It didn't work out, but when you look at local reports out of San Francisco, it's almost suggested that they may not be done and they may still be interested. They're just trying to figure out if they can come up with something. And then there's an article out of Sports Illustrated, but I think it's the local one that runs out of Pittsburgh, suggesting that the Pirates should be targeting Luis Robert Jr. and have plenty of prospects that the White Sox would want. And they're a very deep system. And it's like, look, if you want to add some offensive punch, that's affordable to them. That would fall within their budget. They have a lot of guys that are basically on those ARB contracts or pre-ARB contracts, and they're at the end of their rebuild. Maybe they take a guy like Robert Jr., insert him into the middle of the lineup with this young group of stars, stick him in center field, upgrade their offense. They've got great pitching, and they become that young, hungry, upstart team that wins the NL Central. And that's kind of how it's suggested in the article that I read today out of Pittsburgh. So it's not unheard of that not only are other teams going to knock on the door even through spring training, and they may change their evaluation of Robert Jr., but if he's hot, he could be traded in May, because there are teams that are going to want him and want him the moment they feel confident enough that he's worth the asking price.
Well, and think about some of those teams that we're talking about. The Pirates and the Reds are both teams that, if they're going to make a move in the NL Central, they have to get off to a really good start, because the Cubs are going to be competitive. The Brewers are going to be competitive. That's going to be a division that is not going to roll over for anybody. So if they have designs on competing, they got to get going. The Giants are going to be up against the Dodgers, as they always have been. And if the Giants start to falter, if their offense isn't quite there where they need it to be, which happened to them last year, then they're going to be enticed to make a move. What you want to do if you're Chris Getz is you want to be in a position where you're holding the guy to the point where the other team needs him more than you need to trade him, right? And as we're sitting here right now, and as we've been going through the offseason, the pervasive feeling has been the White Sox need to trade Luis Robert Jr. and Garrett Crochet more than they need to hold on to them, which may or may not have been true, but it certainly came to fruition that the Red Sox, when they realized they were not getting any free agents, they were not getting Corbin Burns, they were not going to grab any splashy free agents for that rotation, it became apparent that they needed to make the move, right? They needed to do this, and they needed to give up some real value to get Garrett Crochet.
And if you believe in 2023, Luis Robert Jr., somehow there's a team out there that actually, if not now, soon, in the first month or two of the season, they see something from him and they go, okay, maybe it was injury. He really is that good. He's better than anything else that's available. And he's at a premium price. Like that's a great cost. 15 million, 20 million, 20 million, 3 years of control of him. In his prime. You're going to have to deal with the injuries. They're going to happen. But if you're a team that sees him get out of the gate quick or sees him having a great spring, whatever it may be, whatever it is you're waiting for, or you finally sit there and say, you know what, we've had plenty of people talk about this, and we agree with what the White Sox are saying. We're willing to up our offer. He is a premium talent at that position. He can help out a lot of teams and slide right into one of those premier spots in their lineup and really change things for them if they believe that's what he is. And that's the entire key to this thing. On the phone line with me right now, the Sox Nerd. Dave Marin puts up all those tidbits and trivia nuggets up on the scoreboard at the rate. Can't wait to start seeing him do it again. I would imagine he's in the middle of a prep, or at least getting ready for his spring prep. And he comes on this show each and every week. Maybe we're prepped for the Sox Nerd. It keeps him sharp. Brought to you by the Village of Lamont. Want to experience a downtown with real history, great eats and drinks, and green spaces filled with adventure? Visit the Village of Lamont. Shop, dine, drink, explore. See everything they have going on in the month of February, including the launch of the Lamont Unlocked podcast coming out next week with the mayor of Lamont and myself kicking it off. See it all at lamontdowntown.com. Nerd, what do you got for me?
Chris, Courtney Finicum really got my attention on the last episode of Sox in the Basement when she brought up top prospects Colson Montgomery and Kyle Teel. Courtney floated the possibility of Montgomery starting on opening day and pointed out Teal's speed despite the fact that he is a catcher. Let's take a look, Sox Nerd style, at those two angles, shall we? Let's say Montgomery makes the start at shortstop on opening day. Should that happen, he will be the first Sox shortstop to make his big league debut in an opener since Mike Caruso in 1997. Prior to Caruso, the last player to do this was Ozzie Guillen, the man Caruso replaced in 1985. Caruso's start was his first of two opening days for the Sox, while Guillen's was the first of 13. Montgomery is a left-handed hitter. Yes, Caruso and Guillen were the last left-handed hitting shortstops to start on opening day for the Sox. The only other lefties to start an opener at short for the Sox are Ernie Johnson from 1921 to 1923 and Frank Shugart in the first White Sox game ever played in 1901. Montgomery will turn 23 on February 27th. That is young, but it won't even be close to the youngest player or even shortstop to start for the Sox on opening day. That honor goes to 19-year-old Cass Michaels in 1945. One more on Montgomery. A native of Jasper, Indiana, Montgomery would become the first Hoosier to start on opening day for the Sox since Indianapolis's Micah Johnson in 2015. Others from Indiana who have started for the Sox in an opener include the big man from Gary, Ron Kittle, Terre Haute's Tommy John, and East Chicago's Ken Lofton. As for the fleet of foot Kyle Teel, he swiped 12 bases while playing 75 of his 112 games at catcher for the Red Sox AA and AAA teams last season. The Sox top stealing catcher in the minors last year had only 6 swipes. It's been 14 years since any Sox minor leaguer who caught at least one game stole 10 bases in a season. And the last time a Sox minor league backstop had as many as the 12 steals Teel had last season was in 2007 when Donnie Lucy, remember him, ripped off 13 bases while splitting time between Birmingham and Charlotte. The Sox have only had 2 prolific base-stealing catchers in their history, and they are both Hall of Famers. Carlton Fisk and Ray Schalk own the top 6 stolen base seasons among Sox backstops, with Schalk's 30 in 1916 the record. Fisk was the last Sox catcher to steal at least 12 bases in a season when he cropped 17 in 1985. Since 1922, only Fisk and Brian Downing, one of the great what-if players in team history, have been the only Sox catchers to swipe at least 12 bases in a season. Thanks, Courtney, for planting this seed in my head, and thanks, Chris, for letting me riff about this kind of stuff. I love it. Before I get to my zinger, I remind you that gems like these and long-form pieces are on my blog, which you can link to at soxinthebasement.com. My zinger, in honor of the 20th anniversary of the World Champions, I'm going to zing frequently about that team, throwing out some gems that you may not know about the 2005 Sox. The member of that sacred team who was drafted the highest was pitcher Dustin Hermanson, who was the 3rd overall pick by San Diego in the June 1994 draft. The player who was drafted the lowest and signed was also a pitcher, Cliff Polite, who was taken by St. Louis in the 54th round. That's the 1,438th pick of the June 1995 draft. That's it, Chris. More than you wanted to know about Montgomery, Teal, Pudge, Schulk, and the 2005 White Sox.
Before we get out of here today, I do want to spend some time. So the back half of the show, Keith Law from The Athletic put out his list of top 100 prospects. Now, I mean, it's just one writer. It's just one scout. It's just one evaluator. That's all this is. But I always find him to be very interesting because everybody always seems to follow each other. And, you know, MLB Pipeline puts out their list, and yeah, you'll see little variations. But Keith Law is always so different from everybody else. He doesn't look at any other list. He's like me with podcasts. And when I used to do morning radio, Ed, I never listened to anybody else's show. I never wanted to steal anything that anybody else was doing. I didn't want to subconsciously do it, so I never listened. I always feel really bad like when the other White Sox podcasters come up and are like, oh, I like your show and blah, 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 and this was great. And I feel like I got to say like something nice to them, like, oh, your show's great too. I don't listen to any of them, folks. I don't listen because I never want to. I just want to have my own original thought. So that's what I do. I don't check anybody else out. I don't besmirch anybody who does, but I think I'm a lot like Keith Law because I don't think this guy looks at anybody else's list. He just makes his own. So I give him some credit for that, and he's another perspective. So I want to go through his list because he's got a few White Sox players in his top 100, and the highest ranking one, which is disappointing to me that it's at 20. We don't have anybody else except for the 20th best one, is Noah Schultz. And he was 79 on his list last year. Everybody's high on Noah Schultz. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but let's read just a couple of sentences here to kind of stick out in his evaluation. He's going to earn comparisons, he's talking about Noah Schultz, to Chris Sale as another lanky, low-slot lefty, but he's a different animal. He may never miss bats at the same rate, but will generate a lot of weak contact and keep the ball in the park instead, as long as he stays healthy, and that's not guaranteed, as the history of 6'9" or taller pitchers is pretty grim. He's going to have a long run of giving hitters nightmares as a top-end starter. And you know what? The thing I picture, whether it's fair or unfair, is some deadliness that you would get from a Chris Sale or even a Garrett Crochet, and also the efficiency of getting guys to ground out or hit into, have poor at bats like a Mark Burley. And I would take that 1,000 times out of 1,000, wouldn't you?
That feels like prime Madison Bumgarner.
Right?
That's what that sounds like.
That's a great comparison. And I'm excited for him. And I think he actually makes it to the majors this year. And he's one of those guys. There's a clock, and you're waiting for when the White Sox say it's time for Noah Schultz. And that's the thing. When you look at this team, I think that by 2026, they're going to have a real battery of good catchers. They're going to find a few hitters in their order, and they're going to have really good pitching. And then you're going to be sitting there saying, okay, but what about the position players? Are they going to spend, or do they go out and find more prospects? Because I think, again, as I said earlier, they're thin. Now, one of those positional prospects, and it's over at the catcher position, is number 37. That's Kyle Teal, who has moved up from 54 on Keith Law's list. And so let's find a little bit of what he said about him, not everything. His glove is ready. His bat is at least ready enough to make contact against righties. White Sox have the luxury of time to let him continue to develop in the majors and hope he reaches his upside of a solid average or better regular behind the plate. He's guarded with Kyle Teal. On the other hand, Courtney Finicum was on this show and I'm going to tell you something. If you didn't hear Courtney Finicum on the last Sox in the Basement, go back and listen to it. I mean, the stories from Sox Fest are amazing. There's some great stuff in there that you're not going to hear anywhere else. She was awesome for telling those stories. I mean, there was a buzz about them, but she did talk about Kyle Teal. how he takes, batting practice in the nude and his attitude and the conversation she had with him. And I can't wait for this guy to make it to my major league club. Like, I'm excited about him. This is like, I'm already becoming a Kyle Teel fan. I've never seen him play. Okay. But,
yeah.
But there's like, he's one of those guys I'm excited about, even if Keith Law is guarded, but he at least have him sitting there in the top 40 prospects right now in Major League Baseball.
Well, and look at what Kyle Teel represents, though, too. When you talk about an average or above average receiver, a catcher, okay, somebody at the position, he's got the glove's ready. So that means that he can sit back there right now. And if the bat is average or above average for a catcher, that's an everyday guy. Okay, that's high praise when you think about catchers, because most catchers are, the glove is ready, the bat will never be. The glove is ready, or he's a one-trick pony. He can put the ball in play, but he's got no power. Or he's got, it's like Cal Raleigh from Seattle Mariners, right? The glove was ready. All he can do is hit home runs. The guy's pretty much worthless otherwise. If he's not hitting home runs, he's not an offensive player in any way, shape, or form. And there's a lot of guys, baseball's littered with a history of catchers because they get beat up back there. They're squatting. It's a tough position to play. So having somebody like Teel like that, but then when you hear about his attitude, like, you got to combine these things. When you hear about like who the guy is, and then you see somebody like Keith Law even give a guarded, like, yeah, we got something here. That tells me that the White Sox have plucked somebody who has a real chance at being a fixture back there and being a real winner.
Just what Chris Getz has done so far has really bolstered this team's ranking in the prospects and made their top end guys. They have more top end guys that you're excited about, that national people are excited about. I mean, if you remove the names that Getz has added, the guys that were getting added towards the end of the Hahn Williams era are not ranked anywhere close to what Chris Getz has been picking up so far. And that is, Noah Schultz was there first, but when we're talking about Teel, and then the guy right after him on the list at 38, because Teel was 37, is Braden Montgomery, acquired in that deal, 22 years old. And Law says he was number 4 on his pre-draft board last year, and then he broke his ankle. And the only questions are this. Here are the two big questions about Braden Montgomery. Whether the ankle injury will affect him. Okay, they probably gave him a physical. I'm not worried about that right now. Okay, I would think that they wouldn't have acquired a guy who the ankle injury was still affecting. And whether he should give up hitting right-handed. This is interesting. He struck out 29% of the time hitting right-handed last spring with a 227, 395, 485 line in college for Texas A&M. He hit 355, this is slash, 355, 465, 819 left-handed. He's got 30 homer upside with strong defense and hard contact to keep his batting average above the median as long as he comes back at 100%. I'm pumped about this guy. Unfortunately, I'm not going to see him for a couple years. I'm not going to get him for a couple years, but I'm pumped about him.
No, but we get a chance to the White Sox get a chance to experiment. And switch hitters giving up one side of the plate is not unheard of. Jose Valentin did it here when he became a member of the White Sox. He was a switch hitter when he was with the Brewers, and then he came here and he started hitting just lefty because he was kind of rubbish right-handed. So it is a stark contrast to sit there and say, and you can sit there and say, well, Keith Law is just doing this because these were guys that were Red Sox prospects. And, there's that East Coast bias. But the reality is that, the Kenny Williams, Rick Hahn duo had not produced a whole lot, right? We've seen the draft picks. They make it up here. But really, when you look back at this last, the Rick Hahn, the big Rick Hahn rebuild, who are the major draft picks that made it up that were inserted into an everyday role and panned out. And panned out.
I mean, and that's the thing, and became anything more than a replacement level player or worse. Number 49 on the top 100 list is Hagen Smith. That's a Chris Getz draft pick, and he was the top lefty in the 2024 class. He's listed as a potential number 2 starter. Law says, I'd like to see him move a little towards the middle of the rubber so he can work more effectively to both sides of the zone. He also says that Chris Sale's name pops up again when you look at him. He's another guy you're going to compare to Chris Sale. And at 53, Edgar Caro, who moves up from 67 last year, and he likes him as well, saying he's a solid average defender with an average arm, still working on some of the finer points of the position, but also a no-doubt catcher whose bat looks like it'll make him a regular there. He may be better off in some kind of soft platoon role, depending on how much of the improvement against righties This past season in the minors is real, but there's an everyday ceiling there. So he's a real catcher who could maybe even convert to another position because he's got a pretty good bat. Those are the only other two White Sox on the list as the show gets close to the end here, Ed. And you know who's left off is Colson Montgomery. He's not on the list anymore. Keith Law, not afraid to drop him off the list, even though Courtney Finicum says he's put on weight in a good way. Looks like he's bulked up, and the White Sox are really pushing the idea he could be the starting shortstop out of camp or soon thereafter. So that's really interesting. I'm pumped about Smith. I'm good with Caro. You know, I was really excited about him. Then Teal came along, and I'm like, okay, I don't know which one's going to be better, but I love Caro's comments in the offseason. I believe he thinks at least that he's breaking camp with the team in some way, based upon his last interview with Scott Merkin. So this guy's got confidence and probably has been told by the team he's got an excellent chance to do it. And then Montgomery, of course, off the list. Your thoughts as we finish up the show?
Well, this Colson Montgomery is the last of this is the guy that's going to lead our team through hell and high water and into the future. And that was the Rick and Kenny era, was there's one big bright shining star and then we'll fill in around him. It's almost as though Kenny and Rick should have been running the Bulls, right? Where you can do that, where you can have the one big player that's out there and then fill in four guys around him. But it doesn't work in baseball, and it hasn't worked. And Luis Robert Jr. is the guy that's potentially on his way out. That was the one big bright shining star, right? And before that, it was Yohan Moncada who started to falter, and then we got Luis Robert Jr. So Colson Montgomery is the guy who's going to come in and make a difference on this team, and he is going to be the one that the White Sox ride to victory every day, every game. We're going to go 163-0, and Colson Montgomery is never going to miss a baseball with the bat. You know, that kind of overhyping of a prospect is going away because Colson Montgomery had a lousy season last year, and maybe he has put on weight in a good way. And maybe he does come into spring, you know, with renewed confidence, and maybe he does come into spring with a change in approach or whatever. And maybe he does break camp as a starting shortstop. But honestly, I'm not going to sing the praises of Colson Montgomery or any of these prospects until they've done it repeatedly, over and over again in a White Sox uniform.
Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement.
Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always on soxinthebasement.com.